Hi, this is Julie, and over the next 6 weeks, I'm thrilled to participate in a program led by my teacher and mentor, Lindsay Para, called Journey to Right Livelihood. I'll be participating as a learner, and as an affiliate, we'll also offer some free special Mother's Quest bonus coaching opportunities to members of my community who sign up. If you're interested in joining, it's not too late. Follow the links in the show notes or Google Journey to Right Livelihood to learn more. If you decide to join, make sure to let me know so I can connect you to the Mother's Quest experiences I have in store. Now, here's the show. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to 2 high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? In the months leading up to a big milestone birthday, I decided it was time to stop sidelining my dreams and realize that I'm the hero of my own journey. I knew I didn't want to do it alone, so I created this podcast to learn from other moms on their own quest, so their words of wisdom and lessons learned could help light the way for mine. I created this podcast for myself. Come along with me, and you'll find some treasures of your own. Hello, and welcome to another new episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. One I'm sharing after a short break so I could focus on transitioning my children into the new academic year, welcoming in the Jewish New Year, and supporting my parents as my father recovers from bypass heart surgery. During this time of reflection and connection to family, it feels right to bring forward this episode on Ancestry with Nicka Smith, a professional photographer, speaker, host, and documentarian with more than 19 years of experience as a genealogist. I learned about Nicka through my friend and previous podcast guest, Jenjii Hysten, one of Nicka's biggest cheerleaders, who regularly acknowledges Nicka's expertise in African ancestor genealogy and her ability to connect young people to their ancestry. Nicka's experience and accomplishments are vast. She's edited and designed volumes of family history that include narratives, photos, and genealogical information, and is the host of BlackProGen Live, an innovative web show focused on people of color genealogy and family history. Using Nicka's life experience, this episode goes deep in how to give ourselves permission to step into becoming our own family historians, the importance of connecting the threads of our ancestors to who we are today, the challenges and emotions involved in tracing genealogy for African American people whose ancestors were enslaved, and the idea that we can become today the ancestors we aspire to be for our descendants by taking the political and social action our times demand. Nicka inspired me to sign up for Ancestry.com and delve into my family history, where I've already uncovered a stunning piece to our family's puzzle that we never knew before. Before I share more, I want to introduce Carrie Caulfield-Arick, founder and CEO of Yaya Podcasting, who has claimed this role of family historian for herself. Here she is with this episode's dedication.
My name is Carrie Caulfield-Arick, and I'm the founder and CEO of Yaya Podcasting, a company that offers podcast editing, production, submission, audio repair, and coaching so podcasters can put their best voice forward. I'm honored to be dedicating this episode of Mother's Quest to everyone searching for their ancestors' stories. Genealogy is insight and context that makes history real. Every ancestor is part of our collective history. It reminds me just how connected we all are. In the decade I've spent researching my own family tree, I've uncovered some fascinating stories, like the great-grandmother accused of witchcraft by a sea captain because he claimed she caused a hurricane during his voyage home. Luckily, hundreds of her neighbors stalled her certain guilty judgment until the witch trials were abandoned in America. But one of my favorite stories is that of my 3 times great-grandmother Alice. With her family and all their possessions packed into a steamer trunk, they left Ireland for America, which had to have been an arduous journey. 2 years later, she was widowed, and she was unable to read and write, so her prospects did not look sunny. Somehow, she was industrious enough to buy land, build a home, and provide security, education, and opportunity for her children. And that home was where my father was born. Through DNA, we know that there are stories yet to be discovered and ancestors who do not have their leaf on our family tree because it simply wasn't acceptable to talk about. They are the Jewish, the Indian, and the North African ancestors of ours, and I plan on giving them their voices back. So for me, these stories are a source of strength during challenging times, and they've created in me a rich and diverse sense of identity that's reinforced my mission to help empower people sharing their own voices.
Thank you, Carrie, for this captivating dedication, especially all you shared about your 3 times great-grandmother Alice and the importance of uncovering the stories yet untold. With Nicka's guidance, I've started the process of connecting the threads of my ancestors. To be honest, I was a little skeptical that I was going to find anything particularly interesting. But while visiting my parents in Los Angeles, my mother and I stayed up late on the couch looking on Ancestry.com at documents connected to her mother, my grandmother Ruth. My mother shared details about Ruth's life in a previous episode's dedication that I'll link in the show notes. We knew that my grandmother Ruth's mother had married what we say in Yiddish was a no-goodnik, who left my grandmother destitute with 3 young girls to raise on her own. That night on the couch, we found a strange named document connected to my grandmother's records, titled Hebrew Asylum of New York City. We clicked on the link and soon saw evidence that my grandmother and her youngest sister had been left in the care of an orphanage, but that sometime after, my great-grandmother came back to get them. My grandmother, who was only 2 at the time and too young to remember, never knew or spoke of the fact that she was separated from her mother. But now my mother and I know that our ancestor, against all odds, found a way to fight her way back to her children. Had she not, my grandmother's fate would surely have been different, and my mother and I might not have been here today. I now know that my discoveries as my family historian are just beginning. I hope this episode and what I uncovered about my great-grandmother give you permission to step into becoming your family historian, to explore the untold stories of your ancestors, and to weave the threads between yourself, your ancestors, and your descendants that will help you more fully live your epic life. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. Hello, Nicka. Welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation for many months and just so happy to have this time with you.
Thanks so much for having me. I know in my crazy, hectic life, it's been quite a challenge trying to schedule me in. So it's definitely good to speak with you finally.
I'm definitely a believer that things happen in the right time. And even though I reached out to you so long ago, I actually think this is the perfect time to have you on because I've been more and more interested in wanting to explore my own ancestry, which is something I have not consciously done. And a few months ago, I interviewed my father for the podcast, and we really delved into his experiences with his mother, who passed away from cancer before I was born, so I never knew her. And I just have this newfound appreciation and interest for really learning about the people in our lives that help bring us to this moment. So this is actually perfect timing.
That's great. First off, I have to say, I'm glad that you sat down and interviewed your father.
Yes, it was really amazing. And we were able to capture so many of the stories and also, his advice for me and future generations about how to live what I call an epic life. We'll get into more as well as the conversation unfolds. Well, I want to move us to the question I ask every guest on the podcast at the beginning of our conversation, which is, tell me a little bit about your childhood, the impact your own mother has had in shaping who you are today, and what you have most been on a quest for.
My childhood I grew up in Southern California. I often joke that I was spoiled in the childhood I had because you could get to the mountains, you could get to the desert. You could get to snow basically in the mountains. You could get to the beach within an hour of where I grew up. So it was almost like a playland, so to speak, when it comes to the environment. Living where I live now, I feel so horrible because people get excited to go to the beach and I'm like, that was something I grew up with. You know what I mean? And so I feel horrible because I'm like, oh my gosh, like I had that. And, it didn't really dawn on me until I became an adult. Gosh, I had that available to me. And even things as significant as when I went to my class reunion last year and I looked around the room and I remember from every age, I had a diverse population of people that I was around. It wasn't foreign to me to have friends that were Japanese or Korean or African American or Jewish or Somalian, or I mean, just all of these different aspects or just different people. My worldview got shaped a lot around the friends and the folks that I was around growing up, all the way through my childhood. So that's something that also sort of shaped me, is the fact that I had a diverse community and I had a diverse experience of locations that was around me as well. Pretty middle class family. My father was, the tried and true blue collar generation where you only work at the same place for 30, 40 years. That was my dad. And my mom was somewhat similar to that. My mother actually worked in food science. So growing up as a child, I think about it even now, when I'm cutting meats and things on the counter or on the cutting block, and I hear my mom saying, don't forget to use bleach on the counter afterwards so we don't get salmonella poisoning. Like I knew what salmonella poisoning was as a child because my mom did food science. She worked where they made literally anything you could think of, Gatorade to Paul Newman salad dressing. Whenever they would make a big batch of stuff, my mother was in the lab testing it to make sure that there was nothing crazy happening. And our house was filled with music. That was a huge part of my childhood, was music. And that was also diverse too, because it wasn't that, we just listened to one type of genre of music. I grew up listening to everything from Frank Sinatra to James Brown to the Sugar Hill Gang to Gladys Knight and the Pips to Kenny Rogers, or I mean, literally our household was like that as well. So even the food was like that. Every year for St. Patrick's Day, my mother had to make chicken dumplings, and because she came from Chicago and they would dye the river green every year. We grew up eating that too. Chinese food.
Before we move on, I'd also like to ask you, what have you uncovered about your own ancestry and what has been the impact of that knowledge in shaping who you are today?
I've uncovered so many different aspects of my family history. I've got one branch of my family that totally kind of exploded my ideas about the whole Native American thing that everybody's family pretty much in the United States claims that they're Native American. And I questioned that and discovered that my family was, and not only that we were, but that we were enslaved by Native American people, which is something that I was never taught in school. And that whole history behind that and the battle that went on for a number of years and still in some ways going on right now for recognition amongst that particular nation of the people who are of African descent. And, it's everything from that to, finding out my great grandmother's father was white and I had no idea, and that he was legally married to my great great grandmother in the state of Kansas in the late 1800s. And they had several children. I had no clue until the descendants of my great great grandfather's siblings started showing up in my DNA results.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's that's one side. To late last year, I uncovered through my grandmother's grandfather's branch of the family that my ancestors were enslaved on the same plantation for more than 30 years with the same owner. And I've not found where they sold a single person off. And through the process of DNA, which is how I learned about this community, there are over 100 people that I have DNA connected to that are traced back to that population of 250 people. And that plantation was owned by a family that lived in Western Massachusetts, even though the plantation was in Mississippi. So that whole idea of the North not really being involved in slavery, oh boy, that's gotten turned on its head too.
Yeah.
So there's everything from that on my dad's side to me discovering the ties to civil rights and social activism on my mother's side, and Then there's other situations of unearthing other European dominant ancestry on my grandfather's side. It's just every day is just something new and exciting, but all of it converges to create me and me sitting here talking to you and the experiences that I go through. And so as I add more layers to my genealogical cake, so to speak, it's sort of looking way more like funfetti than it is maybe just yellow with chocolate frosting.
Those are some incredible things to uncover, and I'm sure some have shifted the way you see yourself and your identity. What do you feel like is the biggest impact of learning these new things about yourself?
I think the biggest impact of learning these things is that I can teach them to my son and I can teach them to other people in my family. And that, when you're having maybe cocktail party dialogue, or maybe, my son or my cousins or my niece has a conversation or has to work on a project in school, it's not going to be a bunch of things that can't be verified or that we don't really know, that this is concrete and that there's a connection to it and that it can't be disputed. One of the biggest turning points for me was reading my great great grandfather's testimony in front of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and seeing him talk about how him and his children have been marginalized as Cherokee freedmen and how they didn't have access to schools, even though they were supposed to. And one of the final things he said was, my children have Cherokee blood in their veins and they should have access to the things that they should. And the fact that I knew that he could have been killed, lynched, whatever, for the fact that he went and told somebody what was going on. And I was like, why can't I assume my birthright if he stood up for me to be able to, And before that, I didn't care about registering with the nation at all. But after that happened, I was like, no, this is mine. Even if I just vote and I don't do anything else, this is something that him living and our ancestors living laid the groundwork for, and it's my right to take it or to take advantage of it. And so I would say having not just an idea, but that it's a fact. That's probably what's made a huge impact on me.
How did this become your passion and your quest?
The genealogy bug was sewn into me, or I guess it jumped onto my clothes. As literally as a 5 or 6-year-old child, we had a family reunion, and I remember we had gotten these family trees at the family reunion. We came back home and I would roll this thing out on the table and I would read it, and I'd ask my mother where all the kids were that were my age and where they lived and all these details about them. And I sort of kept that with me growing up because I had an interest in it, but I wasn't really nurturing it until the time I got to college. And every 2 years of my entire life, we've had family reunions. We even have them now on this particular branch of my family. And I had this idea like, oh, I wonder if there's a way for us to stay in contact when we're not having a family reunion. And so I decided to create a website. Creating a website was how I got into genealogy, literally. Because I thought, maybe, this was in the olden days where you had GeoCities and you had to learn how to hand code HTML, which is so funny now because I don't even know if anyone knows how to hand code HTML anymore because everything just does it for you now. Yeah. But that was my idea. I wanted to create a website. And so I did that for about 5 or 6 years. And I just maintained sort of a list of family members. I didn't really add any facts or anything to it. And then a coworker of mine told me about conducting research online. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she told me about Ancestry. And she's like, well, you should check it out. And I will never forget the first time that I saw my grandmother's name on a census. Will never forget it. I was just like, oh my gosh, because my entire life, she had always been an older woman, but I had the ability to see her as a 14-year-old girl and who was living next door to her and how old her parents were. I never got to meet her parents. My great-grandparents, they were dead 40 years before I was born. So seeing her as a child and her life and seeing her siblings and all of that, like it created this insatiable need in me to try to find out more. And a person is a true genealogist, family historian, when they are constantly chasing after that high that you get the first time that you see a document. That's how you know you're stuck with this for the rest of your life.
I love this idea of being a family historian. Today, with all of the tools at our fingertips, we could all step into that role if we wanted to. But how are the ways that you support other people to step into that role for themselves?
One of the ways that I help people step into the role of being a family historian is in some ways it's validating what they've already done, or really validating the fact that there's a role for you in your family. A lot of folks feel like someone else is going to do this, or maybe that their efforts don't mean a lot, or that they don't know if they're going down the right path. And some of the coaching that I offer folks, or really a lot of the coaching that I offer folks, is the yes, this is exactly how I would have gone about going to find that information. Or when I searched, that's exactly what I found as well. And a lot of it is validation because it's a very important role for someone to call themselves a family historian or to call themselves the family genealogist. If you liken it back to different cultures, whether you're in India and there's a one person in the entire village that keeps the family histories, that's their job. Or if you're in different parts of Africa where there is the griot of the village and they can recount all of the families. These are roles that have existed throughout time. And it just so happens that a lot of folks, especially in our contemporary environment in the United States, they almost don't feel like they're entitled to call themselves that. And through coaching, I admonish people, yes, you can take that role. Yes, you can be called that. You're already doing the work. There's nothing wrong with that. So I definitely would say it's a level of validation and also permission.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because some people feel like there's an elder that has to call you the historian. And no one in my family ever said, Nicka, you're the historian. No one ever said that. I just sort of started walking in what my purpose was. At the time, I didn't know what my purpose was, but I started walking into what felt naturally to me or what felt like I was supposed to be doing. And the people, so to speak, or my family, they then embraced me in the role that now that I'm in. And I just had to be brave and walk out into it. I'll share a small story I'll never forget. I will never forget when I really honestly stepped out into my title, or I moved from researching behind a computer and I ascended to the role of family historian. That just sounds so monarchy, like I was walking up to a throne. But that's totally not how it was. But I remember I had a second cousin that passed away and I never met her. And one of our other cousins was going to her funeral service. And I remember I asked this particular cousin, I said, well, can you pick up a program for me? And he said, okay, sure, I'll pick up a program for you and, we'll connect and I'll get it to you or I'll just mail it to you. And I hung up the phone and I was like, why can't I go to her service? Like it never dawned on me. Why can't I go? Her grandmother and my grandmother were sisters. Her father and my mother were first cousins. I'm a part of her family. Why can't I go to her service? And I said, you know what? I'm not doing anything today. I'm going to go. And this was before we had GPS on our phones, right? Or navigation. So I remember I had to go on a MapQuest and print out the directions. And I had never been to Modesto in my entire life. So I'm like, it was drivable. So I'm like, remember, this is a hurdle that most family historians have to get over is I don't know them. So are they going to trust me? Are they going to welcome me in? Are they going to talk to me or engage me? And I was like, you know what? This is my family. Nobody can tell me otherwise. I know it. I'm going to go. Who says I cannot go? And I went. And after that, I stopped being fearful about whether or not somebody was going to accept me in my role and what I was doing. And so there always comes a time where you're going to be reaching out to people who are not familiar with you. And you have to break through the fear, your preconceived notions about what they're saying about you.
I want to start to talk about living an epic life and delve more deeply into what I call the epic guideposts in your life and see how these threads of you having permission to step into this role and do this work weaves through all of those guideposts. It's interesting that you're talking about giving ourselves permission because for me as a mother, there were many years where I felt like my sole focus was really on my children. My oldest had developmental delays as a child and required a lot of earlier intervention. And then I had years of infertility. So I was really consumed by just being a mother. And yet I had the sense that there was more that I was meant to do in more fully living my own life. And I had also a moment of choosing where I decided I'm not going to wait anymore. And from that moment on, I've been 100% all in on creating Mother's Quest as this extension of myself and work that doesn't feel like work that you were describing. And then also living an epic life, which I see as kind of following my own hero or heroine's journey and being the author of my story in a really conscious way. So the first guidepost in living an epic life is the E for epic. It stands for engaged, and it's about being mindfully engaged with our children. Tell me a little bit about your experience as a mother and the ways that you're connected, and also how you bring this sense of relationship to ancestors.
Yes, my son, he's hilarious. He's very expressive. He's funny, and I have to provide him. He's a kid of few words, and he is in a family with a mom that talks a lot, and everyone else talks a lot. And so I have to be mindful to give him not only the space to speak, but also give him time. My husband is Southern to the bone and very laid back and very just, and I am Southern California, LA all day. So I am literally the 405, the 10 freeway, go, 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 75 miles an hour. My husband is country roads 40. And so my son is sort of like a merging of the both of us, depending on what's going on. So I have to often kind of dial back myself and really just give him the time and the space to just be who he is. And also, it's my job and his father's job to help mold him and to help support him in him growing into who he's going to be, whatever that is. And so sometimes that is maybe going against things that maybe our parents admonished us, not to do. We've learned that it's okay to cross your eyes and let someone hit you on the back. I'm being facetious, but you know what I mean? Just certain things where we were kids, you would have totally gotten in trouble for it. And now is that going to make him a juvenile delinquent, or is he going to get in trouble at school or whatever it is? It's learning how to toe that line. And because I don't want to put so much fear into my child or trepidation, or I just don't want to limit him and his possibilities based off of fear that I injected into him.
Mm-hmm.
And in the world that we're in now, parents are constantly scared. I think that's the reason why you have things like Scary Mommy, where it's like making fun of just ridiculous things that we all do. And it's like, yes, like, why is everyone acting like this is normal? It's not. And so I just don't want to be the old mom. I want to be engaged with him in a way that he trusts me and he knows that he can tell me things, and that even if he knows he's wrong and he's going to get in trouble, that he knows he's coming to me and it's going to happen, versus I'm just not going to say anything to her. His little mind is just expanding and it's growing, and every day he's teaching me something new because he's such a kid of few words. I always say I just don't know. I don't know everything he knows yet, but every day he teaches me something that he knows that I didn't know that he knows. So,
what do you feel like is the biggest lesson you've learned from him recently?
I would say the biggest lesson I've learned from him recently is probably that it's never too late to try something. Or, just because people may think that you're too old or too young to want to pursue something or to do something, that's just all perception. And that really, once you give yourself permission to explore and to see and to do things, that's all you need. There really should be no other motivation that you should need, because you're just interested. And that's okay. Sometimes it's, I talked about 3-year-old lives being, you're the best thing ever, to, oh my gosh, why in the world did I do this? Right? In terms of parenting, because of just emotions and growth and everything. Some ways we can also learn from kids that age, because they don't have any preconceived notions about what they can and can't do. They just try it.
I want to ask you something before we move to the next guidepost. So, your little guy is still young for you to be completely passing the baton on or really engaging him fully in being a family historian yet. But I was reading your bio and I saw that you have done a lot of work around ancestry with young people in Oakland. And I have a 14-year-old who, like me, loves to research. I'd really like to embark on some of this exploration with him. What are some lessons you've learned or some experiences you've had about how to engage older children in this process?
I've worked with hundreds of kids, teaching them how to trace their family history. And I think I would say the number one way of sort of getting them hooked or getting them interested is when you uncover information about an ancestor that has a direct connection back to them. And that even works with adult, or someone who isn't maybe necessarily interested in history. But when you find that thread, there's always a thread. If your family is one big quilt, you use the same thread to sew all the pieces of the patchwork together. But everyone in your family is a different thread within that particular quilt. And so, if it's one long piece, your child may be interested. Maybe they're an artist. Maybe they like to draw. They don't know where in the world they got that particular skill from. They just know how to draw well. Well, maybe you start looking into your family history and you discover that you have other artists in your family or people who could draw well. I have literally my nieces. My niece is an amazing artist. She can draw anything, literally can draw anything. My father was the same way. I cannot draw to save my life. But we have a cousin who was a cartoonist. And
Wow.
I didn't grow up knowing that. I just wondered, like, gosh, how that happened. Or I love to sew. That's one of my pastimes. It's one of the things that I do outside of work. I had an aunt that had a hat shop. She used to make her own hats. She had a whole shop where she did that. I wondered who in the world of my family sews besides me. And doing research, I found that out. I had no clue. So with young people, even with older people, it's finding those things that they are interested in. Maybe your son or anyone maybe has an interest in going into the military. Well, look at the veterans within your family. See where they served, the different places that they went, maybe the branch of the military that they were in. The possibilities are really endless. When I was working with young people, I would ask them, well, what do you know about your family? And those things that normally came out first, they would say, well, I think we're this, or I think we lived here or there. I really want to find this. I'm really interested in this, or it could be a number of different things. But as long as you find that unique thread that the child or the young person is in that family quilt that's also connected to a square from someone else from years prior that also had those same interests or desires or passions, then that usually is your way in.
I really love that metaphor, and I will be using it as I begin to do more of this work. I want to ask you next about the guidepost P, which stands for passionate and purposeful. And this is about the impact that we make in the world beyond our family or being a mother. Tell me what you feel like is your impact now, and what are the things that are filling you up the most in terms of what are the things that are making you feel the most fulfilled in your work right now?
I think what makes me most fulfilled right now is definitely talking to the average person and getting them excited about their family history. And a lot of times that may not be someone who is coming to the conferences that I speak at, or, who may watch the web series, or who even maybe remotely has an interest in family history. It literally could be somebody who was sitting on the plane next to me, or sitting next to me in an airport, or in the grocery store, or, at the post office. I always, even this morning, I was with high school students and there was a young man there and he told me his name was Elliot. And I said, Elliot, you're named after someone, aren't you? And he said, how did you know? I said, because you're 17 and your name is Elliot. And he said, yes, I'm named after my grandfather. I said, exactly. And he said, how did you know that? And I said, because I've spent a lot of time with people and records and things like that. And your name's not Chase.
It's not a contemporary name.
Yeah, it's not a contemporary name. It's Elliot. That is tried and true. You know what I mean? Like John or James or Elijah, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And that could swing in a lot of different ways. Or, I hear someone's accent and I'll ask them where they're from. That for me is something that reignites my passion in family research. is literally those conversations I have daily with different people from different walks of life. And I'm not going up to them saying, tell me everyone in your family tree. It may just be something they mentioned to me. And that helps reignite and sort of re-whet my appetite for what I do with family history research. And in terms of the impact beyond my family, the family that I come from is very outward, very live out loud, very advocate for other people, very mindful of that. It's something I just cannot turn off. My joke is that we all have a certain set of centimorgans on chromosome number 4 that just, we can't turn it off. I really want to allow what I'm doing to energize other people by my example and allow folks to really see that they can do it as well. That it's not something that is just reserved for certain people or certain segments of our society, that it really is available to everyone. And even if your family doesn't have someone famous connected to it, it still is just as valuable as someone else who does. I talked about Coco, and of course, because my son is 3, I've seen the movie 300 times already. But there are aspects of that movie that are so, really, there's one aspect that goes back to what I just said, where people don't feel like their family is important enough, or they don't have anybody famous, or there's nothing notable, there's no one notable that they're related to. Think about the fact that the great-great-grandfather, his picture wasn't on the ofrenda or the ceremonial thing they do for the Dia de los Muertos, and how he was left off. But then you have this famous person who has a house full of things that people have left him. And so it sort of speaks to the quest that we all should have to find those unknown people, right? Like, literally, if you have to play back in your mind, you want him to get across the bridge with the wonderful orange red petals of that they walk on, right? You don't want him to go to the little checkpoint and his face not be there, or their faces not be there.
Yeah.
Because everyone is going to put the picture of the famous person, but they're not going to remember Aunt Millie or anyone else. That's so crazy the Disney movie spoke to me that way, but it did, because I'm a family history researcher. That's sort of what...
how that would speak to you. And it was such a beautiful story. And I had that feeling watching it too, of you feeling like I was missing something in my life. Like, we don't have the mantle with all of our family photos, at least in my house. I don't have that yet. But I think that can be part of what I do as I step into this work.
If your son loves photos and pictures and researching, and because it may be that you may not have the photos of the elders, but other family members do. So
Right.
that could be an extension to your son of researching who might have the photos, or seeing maybe what's already out there. There may be stuff already posted online. There's the thrill of the hunt for that. And one of the things that I wanted to do, because I had a picture of all of my grandparents and I had a picture of all of my husband's grandparents before my son was even born. It's still in his room now. He literally has a family tree on the wall to his great grandparents going in photos, because I wanted him to grow up seeing their faces, even though he would never get a chance to meet them. I wanted him to know what they looked like, so that maybe if he smirks a certain way or anything like that, he can see he's seen those faces. He's grown up seeing them his entire life.
Yeah, I love that idea. I know that we'll be linking to a lot of your resources and that there's so much that you've done that will help people. But in a nutshell, if you were to give a few first suggestions for how to embark on this work, what would you recommend?
So the first thing I always suggest to people is to start with yourself. Don't try to go back to someone famous or infamous and try to trace your genealogy forward. That gets super messy, and, it becomes, just almost impossible unless, someone decently close. So I always suggest that people start with yourself, then work backwards to your parents, your grandparents, and you may or may not have names for those folks, and that's fine, because as you gather documents, the first place that folks should look would be their own home or the homes of their family members. And what you're doing is, for those dates and details that you don't have a family member, whether it's a birth certificate, marriage certificate, death certificate, memorial or funeral program, maybe they've got a driver's license. I mean, there's a number of different places and things you can look for within your home and within the home of your relatives that can give you those facts that you need to try to piece everything together. And then once you do that, then you move into searching online to fill in the holes for those things that you could not find within your own home or within the homes of your relatives. And so even with that step, in terms of going online, that's also when you start to call family members or even a nosy neighbor, or maybe your grandmother's best friend, or, someone who was around who knew kind of what was going on at the time. That's when you sort of employ those folks. And from that point, then I tell people to sort of stick to, the direct lines of the family. Don't try to bounce around too much because, it seems like everyone's family had a Mary and a Martha or a James and a John, and you're trying to remember which side of the family that they're on. So, stick to direct lines. And, once you get online searching, then that's almost like the point of no return because there's just so much out there.
That's amazing. And I know you're connected to Ancestry.com. Do you feel like it's a tool to use once we've done that first round of collecting information internally?
Absolutely. And I would say that yes, because there are 20 billion records on that site. Billion with a B. And that, and it covers not just the United States. It's a number of different countries all across the world. So definitely I would do that, the fact that you don't even have to have a subscription to actually start a family tree on Ancestry. Wow. It's free, so as long as you're just building the tree out, of course, we're going to, once you put the information in, we're going to crawl the top 10% of our databases for you. So basically acts like Google. Once you put the information in there, it's going to crawl the top 10% of databases utilized, and it's going to give you hints on documents. And at that point, then you can utilize, the free, subscription, or, if your local library also usually has an Ancestry subscription that they have. So if you can't afford to have it at home, you can use it at the library as well.
So everybody could have access to this information.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Well, I want to move to the next guidepost, which stands for invested in yourself. And this is about creating space in your life for your own self-care, your own continued growth and learning, and to create opportunities to do the things that you love. What are the ways that you invest in yourself in the midst of this really busy and fulfilling career and being a mom?
Self-care is super duper important to me because the car is not going to continue to run unless you put gas in it. There's not a never-ending tank of gas. At this point, there is not. We haven't entered a world where that has been created yet. Even electric cars need gas, so, but that definitely speaks to the need to be able to take care of yourself. And I do that in a number of ways. I have a garden, a gigantic garden. It's something my father-in-law sort of passed on to me. Ironically, my husband and my brother-in-laws were never interested in gardening at all, but me and my sister-in-law are. And so he almost feels as though I feel like his knowledge is being bestowed between the both of us so it doesn't get lost. The first few years that, we lived closer to my in-laws, he was working on it with me, then he got sick and he was not able to. So last year I just did it by myself. And this year I did it by myself. And he's so funny. He still kind of has to supervise when he goes out to the backyard to see if I'm doing the tomatoes right or, or whatever. Or me and my nouveau gardening technique. This year, I officially got bestowed the title of Master Gardener. I was very excited about that.
Wow.
I grow everything from tomatoes to bell peppers, cantaloupes, watermelon, cabbage, kale, carrots. What am I forgetting? Squash. I've grown corn. I mean, literally peas. I've grown so many different things. Anything that I'm like, what do I want to grow? And then I decide that I'm going to grow it. This year's my theme of off-color fruits and vegetables. So I have purple bell peppers and pink tomatoes and yellow tomatoes. And yeah, so I picked a lot of different color food. It's self-care for me, but it also goes back to, I found this newspaper profile of my great-great-great-grandfather that talked about how he could grow anything. Wow. And it listed out everything he grew. And that was every single piece, everything that was in that story, I grew.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in the desert. The ground is hard, right? It is not moist. It is not, you have to do a whole lot of stuff to get it to do what you wanted to do. I was not raised with a garden at home. Not like that. Outside of grass and maybe shrubs, but growing your own food? No. Once my family left the South, that whole agrarian aspect is just gone. So it's been a unique way for me to reconnect with my ancestors. And then I mentioned earlier, I love to sew, and that was something that was passed down to me by some of my mother's first cousins. In fact, I still have the first pair of pajama pants I ever made. It was me and three of my mom's first cousins that knew how to sew. And we all sort of took a different part and they showed me how to sew. And this was about maybe 10 years ago. They showed me how to sew. And two of the three are actually gone. Now they've passed on. That's also something that I do as a pastime, self-care. You're like, but you're working. It's like, no, you're not, because I'm not on a computer searching for people or doing all the other kind of stuff. I'm active, I'm making things for other people or make stuff for myself. So those are my two ways of engaging and just being off of a device.
Right. As hard for adults as it is for all the times that we lament about the impact of screen time on our kids, it's just as much an issue for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Listening to that, I'm really struck by an experience I had. I mentioned I've been uncovering and starting to learn more about my grandmother, who I didn't know. And she was a voice and elocution teacher. And there is something so powerful, this connection I feel about the fact that I've chosen to find and use my voice, like literally through a podcast. And that's what she devoted her life to helping other people find their voice. It's hard to explain what that feels like when you notice that there is this thread connecting you across generations.
Absolutely. And to me, I would say that's a major motivator to me, because I want other folks to realize that you're not an accident. It wasn't some cosmic bang that happened and you just came from out of nowhere. No, there are literally people living with inside of you that you may not have names for, or you may not know their experiences until you actually go and search them out to find them. And especially if you are from a community, where people have been marginalized or they have dealt with adversity, in unique ways, tap into their experiences as you learn about them to give you hope and to give you purpose and just faith that your situation will either become better, or that because those folks lived through those experiences and you're here, that's a testament to survival and success. And unless you go out and seek the people, you don't know, and you sort of live on this island like, you created everything, or that, you know what I mean? Or that your success is not tied to those people. And that's, I would say, the only way that would be true is if it came from a family of vagrants and, or people who just did bad things. Or maybe you were the only person, who was like that one person in that family, if they were quote unquote bad or maybe negative. Maybe you tied more closely to the people that did not. And maybe there was only one person. Their spirit that lives sort of inside of you is yearning for you to find out about them. It manifests in different ways. It totally does.
This is an amazing segue to the last guidepost, C, which stands for connected to a strong support network. And the idea behind this one is that so you realize that you are not an island, that you are in community on your journey. And I usually think first about this guidepost about the relationships in our lives, like the core relationships, like with our partners or our friends. But I want to start with what you've just been talking about, which is how we can feel connected to a larger sense of community or to ancestors. Can you share a little bit about what that has meant for you? And I know that you've also done a lot of work about how African American people can trace their history or learn things about their community and culture, given the fact that it is harder to find the record, or literally they were taken from their homeland against their will. I'd love to hear more about that part of your connection.
I think that from the vantage point of looking at my own family, it helped me understand the community of folks that were enslaved better. I say that because on the side of the family that I got started doing research on, there are 3,700 people that I've traced to that side of the family. And we don't all live in one location. We live in 23 states and 4 countries.
Wow.
And because we're so spread out, and I had this insatiable need to connect us so that if you were going to visit Las Vegas, or if you were moving to wherever, you would know that you weren't there by yourself. Because it's weird. We never move somewhere where there isn't somebody else. And if you are the first person, someone else is coming. Like literally, I can just say, oh, that's going to happen, because I've never been proven wrong about that. And the reason why I make that correlation to the enslaved population is back then, you basically lived your life in trepidation. You didn't know if the slaveholder dies, if he dies without a will, whoever was given the letters of administration by the court was going to come in. They were going to do an inventory of all the property, which included people. And that person, at their discretion, could decide for one reason or another, maybe the slaveholder had debt that needed to be paid, that they could sell people off. And it didn't matter that people were part of a family, right? You constantly lived in this environment of potentially being taken somewhere where you didn't want to go. And because you lived in that environment, it didn't matter who people were who lived with you on a particular plantation or wherever you were. Those folks were your family, regardless of if you were related by blood or not. And you had to recreate this every single place you went, because the trauma of coming over on the ship and making it through that was one thing. Now you're separated from your family. Then, unfortunately, great, but you're here in this plantation with these people you don't know. You don't know the language they're speaking. You have to pick it up. Someone's going to take you under their wing because you could be them. That's oftentimes how we live. So we just claim ownership over people. We do. And it's because of that experience. And so that is where the first seeds of a network begin, especially if you are a person of color, especially if you're somebody who's of African descent who lives in the United States. It's why when you see movies like Black Panther, everybody is so enthralled with it and we own it. It's because we haven't had a connection to something that we could all own by ourselves. There was always a question or, well, maybe that's not it. No, this is something, this is ours. We've complete ownership over it. Everybody's got their sticker with their name on it. That's what it is. And so with genealogy, especially with families, especially with DNA, with what it's doing and expanding the bounds of what family means, because this is inviting you to people that you don't know, but that you are connected to genetically. And that is a new frontier of the network, because you're having to forge relationships with people that you don't know, and you have to give yourself permission to reach out to these people and send them messages and to be okay if you deal with rejection or any of these things. And so networks are very important because we need that support. You need those folks who are going to tell you you're wrong when you're wrong, or comfort you when you're upset or you're having challenges. You need those people, and whether they're blood related or not. And I would say for me, the most powerful connections that I've made have been folks that understand that experience, or people who have a yearning for history and knowledge and understanding how history informs the decisions and the choices that people make now. And that they're not just looking at things from a literal timeline of today, but choices and decisions that were made impact how we're living now and what we can do to change those trajectories or the fallout from those things. Those are the folks that I have the most powerful connections to.
I can't help but think about the connection between what you've been describing in terms of the impact of, Black people living in this country, coming from enslavement, always wondering or worrying about whether they would be pulled apart again, and how they've created networks with who they're with. I can't help but think about what's happening in our country right now at the time of this recording. So many parents and children at the border who have been separated. And you just mentioned there's this way of learning from history. I'm curious about what you feel like are some of the lessons learned to take from all that you've uncovered in this exploration of networks of marginalized populations.
The first example I can think of, and I have several in my family, my grandmother's grandmother lived to about 1942. Of course, I wasn't old enough to meet her, but Grandma Alice, up until she died, and she was in her 90s, periodically she would just cry and relive the experience of being sold away from her family.
Wow.
And my grandmother grew up, by the time her grandmother passed away, she was in her 30s. And several family members recall Grandma Alice crying profusely, emotional, just the trauma of being sold away from her family. To this day, we don't even know who her parents are. No clue who the people are. And when I recall her story, and the fact that a woman in her 90s was still dealing with trauma from being separated from her family.
Yeah.
It makes me automatically think about what's going on just literally with our immigration system right now. And as many people would say, oh, well, the kids are 2 and 3 years old, they're not going to remember. 90-year-old woman remembered. If it's another great great grandmother of mine who literally was quit claimed over on Christmas as an infant away from her mother. And, the fact that literally history, it literally is almost repeating itself.
Yeah.
Like, literally, that's in essence what it is. And so, it's really telling how we all respond to these things now. With my family's involvement in a lot of different civic and social justice things throughout time. I mentioned that area on chromosome 4 that we all have. I often talk to my family who were much more involved than me about what are some of the stark differences that they see in how people reacted to the things that they did when they did them and now. And one of the things that they tell me is that folks get really forgetful about how they responded to different crises and things at the time. That as history happens, everyone becomes as much nicer than they were then, or they provided opportunities and things that they didn't. I often question myself, how am I responding to these things? And will history be kind to the way that I responded to them? On a human level, remove race, remove class, just as a person. How kind is history going to be to me and how I responded to whatever it is? So that's what I always walk away with is gut to gut, person to person, vein to vein, blood to blood, human to human. How am I responding to what I'm seeing? And when my child or my grandchildren or my great grandchildren come and they ask me, what were you doing when this was going on? Can I look at them with a straight face and tell them exactly what I did or how I thought about it? Because think about it. We're talking about interviewing yourself, right?
Right.
Can you answer with a clear conscience? Because your descendants are going to come back and ask you, what were you doing when this was going on?
Yeah.
And that's tough. That's tough.
That's a really powerful frame to really think about. Because I was struck by, and I think I shared on social media, a quote that Kamala Harris shared recently, which is like something about like people will not be asking us, how did we feel during these times? But what was the action that we took? And, because I think we all share, how horrified we are, how saddened we are. And those feelings are one level of a reaction, but it's like, what kind of action are we called to as a result of those very human feelings? And I think this additional thing that you've just added about like thinking about our descendants and what we would want them to know about us and how we responded now is so important.
Yeah, for me, I always remind people, literally I had 3 people in the Freedom Rides. 3 of my mom's first cousins were in the Congress for Racial Equality. I had a great uncle who testified in front of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. And those are just the 4 people off the top of my head that I think of. And for me, I feel like within the family that I come from, the call to action is much more because I have those folks who literally put their bodies out there or their livelihoods out there. And I'm living on that promise that they had within them that someday, whatever they were experiencing because of the color of their skin was going to end. And so, how do I walk into life now knowing that I come from folks who were willing to sacrifice not just for me, but for everybody? And I just don't do anything about it. I don't say anything. I don't advocate. I don't give. I don't volunteer. Right? It's like the descendant of the great grandparents, who reaps the harvest of their hard work through a trust fund. Do they truly understand the sacrifice and the blood, sweat, and tears that was put into making sure that they had a livelihood today?
Yeah.
How do you appropriately communicate that? So that's my constant battle. And when I have issues or, when I get frustrated, those are the folks that I call. I call them and say, how in the world did you guys wait 10 years for this to happen? Like, I'm upset because, I'm like, I want something to happen now, but how did you guys survive? And the main thing that they tell me is we went to the next issue. While that sat and simmered until it was done, we went to the next thing that we could work on to keep our attention and our morale high. And so that's what I do too.
That's really powerful. I feel like this is a good time to move then into the challenge that you would be offering to me and anybody else who wants to say yes to it, both in terms of like starting to step into this work of claiming for myself, being a family historian. But I'd love it if you could also weave this connection to what is happening today and taking the lessons learned of our descendants and also like stepping into becoming the ancestor that we would want to be for our future generations in terms of acting on what's happening in our country right now. What would your challenge be for me?
I want to challenge everyone to look into their ancestry and to see the connections that what their ancestors live is repeating itself. There's a cliche statement, history repeats itself. And really and truly, honestly, it really shouldn't be cliche. It really is the truth. You know, it makes me think of a fellow family historian genealogist named Jennifer Mendelsohn with the work that she does when people who are in Congress will make these statements about immigrants and things like that. And them not recognizing that it's easy for someone to trace their own lineage and to see that they themselves come from immigrants. And if the policies or statements that they were making were applied to their ancestors, they wouldn't be here. And they definitely wouldn't be in political office to be able to speak on behalf of the people. And so I feel like as we learn more about history and how that shapes what we're living now, that opens up folks' minds to why the decisions and aftermath of whatever we're dealing with right now, why it is the way that it is. And really look at it honestly and truly, because you know, there's power in being honest about the circumstances. You know, what good is it serving, you know, for a family of Jewish descent to deny that their family was involved in the Holocaust? Like, why would you deny that? Why would you not want to own that experience? That is painful. That's traumatic. The effects are still being felt now, right? Why would you deny that experience, you know, to potentially posture and say that we've eclipsed that, we're better than that now? Yes, you are, but that still informs who you are now. It's the same thing with people who were formerly enslaved. You know, no one wants to own that you were owned by other people. The same thing goes for folks whose families owned people.
Right.
Right? But there is power in the truth. Yes, we did. But, you know, look at examples like Plessy versus Ferguson. It's a huge case with separate but equal. That's what we learn about it. But a lot of folks don't realize that Homer Plessy's descendants and the Ferguson descendants formed a foundation. And they do advocacy work together, the descendants on two separate sides of the same issue. So, my challenge to everyone listening and to you is to really just take a deep dive. If there's an aspect of what's going on in the world today, if it's immigration, you know, dig into your family history through that lens. How did we get here? Who immigrated? Why? And then apply that. And once you learn those facts and those details, when you're watching things on the news and how they're reported and you're hearing from our leaders, you can't switch it off.
Yeah.
So, you know, and the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, give yourself permission to look for this information, you know, and also prepare yourself as well, because it can totally get emotional.
Yeah.
You know, and that's where the self-care comes in, where you have to kind of take a step back sometimes because it's a lot. History is powerful, but it's also very emotional. And you also have to give yourself the space to be able to emote when you do find things and figure things out. But I just really, in this climate that we're in today, look at one particular issue or thing that has just really tapped at your heart or really has made you want to galvanize yourself to go out and speak or fundraise or do whatever. Maybe it's voting. Who's the first person in your family who voted? You can find that out.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think so. First of all, yes, thank you. I definitely accept the challenge. I'm excited to do this work. And one of the things I've been on the quest for, really, you know, some of it is sparked by your dear friend, Jenjii Hysten. She started opening my heart and mind to the impact of police brutality on families of color who really worry about the safety of their children every day. And so I've started stepping into more activism, particularly in that area. And so I am curious. I think I want to know, I'd like to find the answers to, do I have ancestors that stepped into using their voice or their privilege or their power across divisions in other times of history? How would I go about figuring that out?
Yeah, no, that's a great place to start. Look at arrest records. Like, see if they got arrested for it, right? Or maybe it was in the newspaper. Or especially with public facing things like the newspaper, how were they referred to in their community, right? Were they looked upon favorably? Were they not? You can also look up, especially with certain groups, church records. People do not delve enough in church records. What roles were they serving within their organizations, their religious organizations? Were they fundraising for different people or for different causes? Or, maybe they were the ones that went around and fed people, or, there's a number of different things. Like my grandmother was in this unit called the Keep Shining unit. And I thought the name was hilarious. When I talked to my mom, I was like, what is the Keep Shining unit? And she said, they specifically went around and rewarded people that they thought were doing a good job. That was her job at church. There are so many different avenues or things you can look at. And it may even be to interview folks that lived around them or that can recount what they heard their parents say about those particular ancestors of yours. It's a number of different things, but you'll use the nuts and bolts of genealogy, things like the census or vital records to kind of fill in the pieces as to, okay, if I call this person, I have to ask about this or that, or when they lived at this particular address. What was around there? What else was in the community around them? Those are things that I would imagine are ways that you can find that out. The possibilities are almost kind of endless.
Yeah, I can see how you really just become a detective.
Yes, literally, I call it advanced trolling. That's basically what it is.
Advanced trolling. I love that. Way to bring it forward into our current modern day vernacular. Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you. And I assume I can reach out to you along the way if I hit some roadblocks. And how would also me or others work with you to get support to move through this?
Sure. I have a website, whoisnickasmith.com. I offer coaching. And if there's an area that I know someone who is a colleague of mine, a really awesome researcher that I can connect you to, I have no problem doing that either. I know a lot of amazing people too. So definitely reach out, see if I'm definitely a good fit. And if I'm not, then I will be sure to track someone who is potentially. But yeah, I'm just excited to, I'm always excited when someone gets interested in looking into their family history and seeing what's there. And I actually had a cousin of mine just recently got her DNA results, and she only knew her grandmother's name because she died when her mother was 3 years old. So all she had was a name. And in literally a weekend, I've traced her back like 3 or 4 generations. And hearing this 81-year-old woman like come alive because she now has more of a context on our grandmother's side of the family is, gosh, I just live for that. Like, I feel like, yes, my job in your life is done. Like, like I can give you more, and calling her earlier and saying, hey, did you know your great great grandfather was a bugler? He was in the Civil War. That was his job. He played the trumpet. He was the one that sounded off that they were going to start. And she's like, oh my gosh, I said, you're a musician. So when I saw this, I just could not believe it. And she's like, my mother played the piano. My aunt played the piano. And she's like, and my other aunts, they played the trumpet. And she's like, and I said, clearly it's tied to this guy. Like, this is the coolest thing ever. And so
that's amazing.
Yeah. So I just say, jump in, give yourself permission, and just be open to what you'll find.
Wonderful. Well, I will keep you posted. I hope you'll be part of the Mother's Quest community too. And as others say yes to exploring this, hopefully they can share their stories with you, and you'll know that you were some part of making those connections happen.
That's awesome. Can't wait.
And also, we'll make sure, I know you're going to send me links. So if there are other resources that we haven't discussed yet in this episode, we'll put all the links in the show notes so that people can see all of your top recommendations for how to move through this. I want to close now, and we close every episode with acknowledgement, which is an opportunity for each of us to share what our takeaways are from this conversation and anything in particular that we appreciate about what we've uncovered here together. I like to start, and I want to say that there's definitely this theme of giving ourselves permission to step into this exploration, permission to call ourselves a family historian if that is something that we're aspiring to, permission to experiment, which is a gift that your own child has given you, and also permission to look for these like threads and connections that run through our family history that can shed light on who we are today. Just a really new, deep understanding about all of that. I think this idea of the weaving that you talked about, the quilt and the weaving, is really powerful. I'm going to hold that metaphor. And then the last thing I'm really struck by is this conversation that we were having at the end about, what our descendants will think of us. What are the stories or the things that they're going to uncover about how we're choosing to live our lives, and especially how we're choosing to stand for the things that really matter in the midst of a lot of challenge that's happening right now. I have a friend, Tammy, who's also interested in Ancestry, and she talks about the fact that we can already step into being the ancestor we want to be for our descendants. So I'm holding that concept together too with everything that you shared. Thank you so much for really deepening my awareness and understanding about all of this.
It's definitely been my pleasure. I would say for me, my takeaway from this is to value my own journey and my own story, and not to minimize what I'm contributing to, our family history and where my mark is in the world, to focus on other people. I think as mothers, because of the nature of the work that we do at home, which is, our most important job, we oftentimes overshadow ourselves. We don't go and get this. Maybe we skip the pedicure this week or whatever it is, right? Maybe we'll go without eating. It's a number of different ways it's manifest in our lives, and we push ourselves down a lot. We totally do that. For sometimes it's right. It's the right thing to do, right? You would naturally do that. But in a lot of ways, I feel like we also have to give ourselves permission to be like dad too. Where it's not necessarily that mom has to be there to do that, that you've got a partner there with you, or you've got a community of folks there with you, and that you can be okay with that and having your own personhood as a mom. That is, I would say, definitely one of my takeaways and one of my reminders is to maintain my personhood while being a mother.
Yeah, that was one of the intentions that you shared before we started about being able to connect the dots between your motherhood and your work, but still really own who you are in the midst of both. Well, thank you again for saying yes to this and for finding time for it in the midst of all your travel and all the meaningful work that you're doing. I will definitely keep you posted as I start to move through this, and I look forward to staying in connection and community together.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about the Mother's Quest community, head over to mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review, and help us spread the word. I want to end with some words to help light the way on your quest. Seize the day. Love your people. Honor your gifts. Until next time.